started last week, we started a new series looking at a particular paper, and it comes from this collection of 7 papers which has been written over the last few years. It's been written by a very senior order member called Subhuti, and he spoke to our teacher, the founder of this movement, Bhante Sangharachita. These papers have come out of conversation and represent Bhante's thinking on many aspects of Buddhism and practice. This collection of papers is actually for sale in the bookshop if you're interested. Very comprehensive, not particularly accessible, but very interesting, comprehensive collection of thoughts and ideas, and really sums up how we practice and how we approach practice in Triratna. And the paper that we're looking at the moment at Dhamranight is called Suprapersonal Force, or Energy Working Through Me. So I'm just going to look at a snippet of that paper, so one paper among 7, a few paragraphs among one paper, just drawing out some of the themes of that. So I'll be drawing on that, and also I'm also drawing material from this memoir, the third in a series of memoirs, I think it's the third or final, by our teacher Bhante Sangharachita. And he was a prolific writer. He has always been a prolific writer, so we have a lot of detail of his life, which is fascinating reading. So that's the material that I'm drawing from. I'm going to recap a bit. Jnanavarcha kicked us off, and what he was saying is very important, fundamental to what we're going to be looking at. So for those of you who weren't there, and those of you who may have been here, just a reminder. So last week we went into quite a lot of detail about karma. So it's a familiar word. It's used sort of quite carelessly in the modern world. It means something very particular in Buddhism, and we drew out that. So what it means is willed action. Karma means a willed action, and we use one way of describing it is a set of laws. So we exploit our ability to make choices, and we use that skill. We can either use that skillfully. So what skillfully means cultivating awareness, generosity of other people, generosity towards other people, or we can use it unskillfully, willful ignorance, aversion. We could spend a long time looking at unskillful behaviours. I think we know what the flavour of it is. So what karma, the law of karma, points us to is that what we do with our minds has an effect on our minds. So it's not about obeying rules, it's not about following a particular creed, it's just noticing what happens if I do this, what happens if I do that. And yeah, it's very immediate. I think we know that, don't we? That particular thoughts, feelings, actions have a very immediate effect on the next moment. If we act skillfully, so with awareness, generosity, kindness, truthfulness, if our conduct is based on those attitudes, then we find that more and more we become more confident ourselves. So we become more integrated. We're following values that actually we know that are good for us, and this helps us become confident, even courageous human beings. So karma is very, very important, just for living well in our world, for living well in our world. And sometimes we make quite interesting leaps in our ethical behaviour. So maybe we've been lifelong meat eaters, and maybe we realise actually we just don't want to do that anymore. And this can be quite liberating. Yeah, we can. Although it may seem like that we're actually giving something up and that's going to be difficult, it actually can feel very liberating. I've experienced this myself, changing behaviours. I haven't done it in order to feel good, but actually it's almost become there's been a physical result in myself. I feel well in myself, I feel well in my body, and a sense of confidence. So so negative mental states can be purified by our skillful action. And what this, we have to remember, and Jnana was asking us to really take into account, is that skillful action is to do with our intention. Okay, and that's where it comes into not following a creed. There's no recipe. There's guidelines, perhaps, of what skillful action looks like, but we really have to examine our intentions. And the more we do that, the more it becomes easy to recognise what the next skillful action is. So it's really very life-enriching set of principles to use in our lives. To get a more fulfilled, meaningful sense of life. And Jnana talked about in the next moment from doing a skillful action, consciousness becomes more expansive, bright, clear, creative, flexible, and more connected. And who doesn't want that? Don't put your hands up if you don't want that. Don't want to know. And do you see how that mindset would have an immediate effect on those around us? You know, being around someone who is like that has a positive effect on us as well. So we affect ourselves in the future, and we just the karma can sort of ripple out. There's a kind of a spatial effect. It has an effect on other people. Gives them the choice actually to behave well. Yeah. So very important. A lovely balance of self-examination and examining the needs of others. And it's, as I say, it's usually pleasurable and rewarding. And sometimes, although I say that, usually pleasurable and more rewarding, sometimes we have to go through some discomfort to behave in a new way. It's we go beyond the familiar. It's actually going to feel a bit uncomfortable. Maybe we have to be noticed, to stand up for something, or point something out that we don't want to collude with anymore. And that will be uncomfortable, actually. So we're very much concerned with, in Buddhist practice, we're very much concerned with using karma, niyama processes, so a set of laws. We didn't make them up, no one invented them, it's just how things actually are, to allow something else to emerge. And that's the concern, actually. I would say it's the concern of all religions. It's certainly the concern of Buddhism, is how we behave to open up to, say, the transcendental. So karmic positivity is not the highest state that a human can reach. So we're talking about living a happy, healthy human life. It's not the highest state, it's not the pinnacle of human ability. So we can move beyond karma, and this is when we can start to talk about dharma niyama processes. And what I want to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about dharma niyama processes, and I'm also going to look at how that is demonstrated in a life. So I'm going to look quite a lot at the life of our teacher. I think we can sit and talk about philosophy for a long time, but actually I can't. One could, but it might not have. It might not impact us. I think we can get to a more subtle, nuanced understanding of what principles, how they impact a life by looking at people's lives, looking at examples of how people have lived, and what we get what we get when we do that is, if we look at Buddhist lives lived, we begin to understand that applying Buddhist principles doesn't mean that we all become Buddhist cutouts. Yeah, we don't. You know how in any what are they called, gift shop, you can buy a little Buddha and it kind of looks the same as the next one on the shelf. Blah, blah, blah. So we're not trying to become like gift shop Buddhists, gift shop Buddhists. And when you start to look at Buddhist lives lived, you just see how individual people are, how strongly individual, how sort of very defined the characteristics of great Buddhists are, and very, very different from each other, which I find quite exciting. Is that the more you apply the principles of Buddhism, which are universal principles, the more the individual can actually flourish, and the more almost the more varied a human being can be. I've slightly gone in a different direction. Anyway, so, when we're looking at Dharma Nirma processes, so these laws, it's very, very difficult to talk about Dharma Nirma processes actually. It's a moving from karmic conditionality, in which we still have a very strong sense of self, very, very aware of what the self wants, able to use it skillfully, able to have a sense of mastery over the self. But at some point, we, as Buddhists, would like to let go of that, and the reason we do that is actually the self is a cause of, whether we're living ethical lives or not, it's a cause of a lot of pain, and it limits us. So that's what we're concerned with, noticing actually that we're not inherently fixed human beings. We're not inherent. There's nothing inherent. There's nothing inherent about the sense of self, about selfhood. There's nothing inherently fixed about anything. So we can notice it about ourselves as human beings, our characters, but all phenomena are of the same. They're of the same condition. That there's nothing essential, fixed, defined about it. So hopefully we'll see a bit more about the implications of that. And just to say that seeing through a sense of selfhood is not an entry into oblivion. So we're not talking about nihilism, we're not talking about the end of anything. It's not a descent into nihilism, which it can seem like. It can sometimes seem like. It's not a reduction of experience. What we're talking about, as the subtitle of this paper, is energy working through me. So we're using karma nirma processes to open up to something which is greater, beyond the self, includes the self. It's not necessarily separate to it. We're not talking about a divine being manifesting in ourselves. Although sometimes people can experience, people have strong religious experiences, and it can feel like divinity. It's that to call it God, would be to create something that's not actually there. So we're steering between, with this kind of language, we're steering between nihilism and eternalism, which is very important. Both of those are too crude a description, of ultimate reality. Yeah. And actually, if we're opening up to Dharma Nirma for processes, it's also, we need to be clear that it's not just some kind of massive channeling of our own ambition, drive, however good that is. It's not like our own superhero ego acting in the world. Yeah. So, this evening I'm going to look at Bhante Sangharakshita. I'm just going to call him Bhante. It means teacher. I'm going to look at his life and a very particular period of his life, which gets talked about quite a lot in this paper. It was a very specific incident, and I'm going to look at the conditions around that incident, and we'll see if we get an understanding of what this might mean for us in our own lives, and what Dharma-nima processes might be. And another point I want to make is that the more that we use the principles of karma in our lives, at some point we'll start to get glimpses. So we'll get glimpses of something else. We'll get glimpses of the transcendental Dhamma-nima processes. And more we can orientate our lives towards that, more and more. And at some point in the life of a Buddhist practitioner, or over lifetimes, Dhamma-nima processes become dominant. So there's a sort of tipping point. And this is articulated in different traditions in different ways. So we might know the term stream entry, so we sometimes talk about stream entrant. And that just means it just means that to reduce it as a very significant point in a practitioner's life. What it means is that they're inevitably drawn to in nirvana, enlightenment, that they've practice is so strong, it's almost they can't help it but to orientate themselves towards the truth of awakening. And this is sometimes also in other Buddhist, there's other systems, we can talk about the arising of the bodhicitta, so that's also another term that you might know. And I don't want to sort of say they're all the same, but there's something of the flavour of all of those. This tipping point between karma-nima processes and allowing Dharma-nima processes, we're getting out of the way to allow Dharma-nima processes, something bigger than ourselves, to respond. Yeah. And we do need to keep discussing and exploring it so that we don't fall into these traps of thinking that actually we know what it is. We don't know. We don't actually know what it is. So we can't. The tendency, such a strong tendency of the human mind to hold on and fix and create an idea, that we just have to keep the language of this of these processes alive and resonant. So that we're actually motivated to practice. So, can I just check, is everyone on board enough to carry on so far? Are there any clarifications or questions? Yeah? Okay. So as I said, I want to sort of, rather than explain, I want to demonstrate what this might look like. And to do that, I'm going to go back to India, 1956, when our teacher Bhante was about 30 or 31. And what he was trying to do, he was working for Buddhism. He was a part of a small group of people trying to revive Buddhism in the land of its birth. It had been really subsumed by Hinduism. Hinduism, very all-encompassing religion, and it had consumed Buddhism, and that there are a few Buddhists in that country trying to reclaim it, clarify the Buddha's teachings. And Bante had gone there to, he was interested in going to the land of the Buddha's birth, so he'd gone there, he'd been conscripted during the Second World War, and he'd stayed in India. So there, in 1956 in India, when our teacher was about 30 or 31, there was a particular incident, and I'll look at the incident and then look at the conditions around it. During that time, there and there still is a massive population of what used to be called untouchable Indians. Untouchable, so outside of the caste system. So not even the sort of a very particular hierarchy, the caste system, and the so-called untouchables were not even part of the hierarchy, they were just out of it. I mean, Bante even talks about, before this time, that actually there were people called unseeables, so if there's someone purer than them came along the road, they would have to hide in the hedgerow. That's how lowly they were regarded. So this the untouchable caste, so-called untouchables, a massively long history of being treated inhumanely, being seen as inherently impure and polluting, and of course we react very strongly to that. That we wouldn't want anyone to be treated like that. But because of the tradition of the society, and it was very, very insidious, it was very, very hard, even though legislation had been put in place, it's very, very hard to change people's attitudes. And our teacher was in touch with a campaigner, a politician called Dr. Ambedkar, and if you've been around Triratna for a while, you will have heard people talking about Dr. Ambedkar. I'm not actually an authority on this, but this whole scenario is very significant in actually it's very significant for our movement. Yeah, so Dr. Ambedkar has been born as an untouchable himself. He'd actually, through various fortunate experiences, he'd actually had university training. He'd been to London, was trained as a lawyer, and he'd got involved in the government, so he actually had some influence. Nevertheless, even though he was in government office, caste Hindus would avoid him, eschew him, wouldn't drink from the same water as him, wouldn't sit in the same chair as him. So I don't know if you can imagine that kind of situation. Yeah. And Dr. Ambedkar, so he had a very, very strong feeling for his people, these people who he could see the injustice, the horrible injustice of this situation. And he could see that reform, I think he initially had hoped that maybe reform within Hinduism was possible, but he quite quickly saw that that wasn't possible. He disagreed with Gandhi about this. He saw that actually Hinduism was not going to help these people. He was not going to help. So he was looking for something else. He was looking for something to unite the Dalit community, and he was looking for something that would give them a sense of an ideal to work towards. And various explorations, communism, Christianity, but what he decided actually that Buddhism was the way forward. So, he decided that Buddhism, because of this aspect that it's not. Well, actually, there's something very progressive about Buddhism, that this creative, that anyone can work with their minds, and anyone can make progress regardless of your birth rights, and it's not to do with rules, inherited traditions. So he felt that Buddhism was the way forward for his community. He read extensively about it. He read a lot of the history of Buddhism. Had a very heartfelt understanding of the Buddha's teachings. And actually, what he organised was a mass conversion of many of his people. So, and he was in dialogue with Bhante Sangharakshita about this, how the best way to get Buddhism to the Dalit community. And what happened was, that there was this conversion, and there was suddenly hope for the people. Yeah, there was suddenly hope. They'd rejected Hinduism. They were just like, I'm not part of that. And they're actually able to take themselves seriously, not be victims, just take themselves seriously as human beings with potential for growth. Yeah, so many thousands of Dr. Ambedkar's supporters had this conversion. And a few weeks later, slightly on a different track, put them aside, our teacher, he's been on a tour and he's been exploring meditation in different ways. And he's got this, I wouldn't say teacher, but he's got a friend who's very, very into meditation and seems to, introduces Bhante to the idea that meditational experiences may not always come from the self, that there might be something working through us. So Bhante's doing that, he's exploring meditation, and his friend wants him to stay with him and stay on retreat. Bhante Sangharakshita just has this inkling that that's not the thing to do. He has this intuition. I'm just going to read you what he says about this, because it's really interesting. Yeah, so he was staying with a friend who was strongly urging him to stay with him over the next few weeks for this meditation retreat. He would have quite liked to have done so. It would have been quite easy for him to do so. And there was no practical necessity for him to not do it. He couldn't think of a reason to not do it. But for some reason, he knew he had to go, and he knew he had to go to Nagpur. How I knew this, I was unable to say, any more than I was able to say why it was essential for me to be on my way. I did not hear an inner voice, neither did I have a sudden intuition. It is simply that I knew, clearly and certainly, that I had to be on my way. So, accordingly, he fixed a date, and when he left for Nagpur, he said he felt some satisfaction, even relief, that at last I was acting on the knowledge that it was essential for me to be on my way, though why it was essential I did not yet know. And it became very apparent as to why this was essential. He arrived at Nagpur at 1 o'clock. 1 hour later, wherever he was staying, there was a disturbance, and a few people came running in, and they said that Dr. Ambedkar, the hero of the Dalit community, had died. He died during the night. And what happened next is, it's significant. It's significant. So many tens of thousands of Dr. Ambedkar's supporters were gathered in Nagpur. And Bhante realised, even though he didn't feel adequate to the task, he realised that they needed a focus and they needed someone to rally them. So people were in despair. Their sort of beacon of hope had just collapsed. They were in sort of agonies of grief about the death of Dr. Ambedkar. And Bhante says, though deeply moved by the plight of so much anguish and despair, I realised that for me, at least, this was no time to indulge in emotion, even though this was his friend also who died. And so he organised a condolence meeting, and slowly, that evening, they managed to get a stage and some lights, not very much, and 100,000 people were present, 100,000 people. I don't know if you can imagine going and giving a condolence talk to 100,000 people without having prepared. But Bhante was able to rise to this. And he says there was some hope, so he managed to convey to Dr. Ambedkar's grieving supporters that there was some hope, all is not lost. They could still rescue themselves from their situation. And he describes an extraordinary experience. So he says, above the crowd hung an enormous presence, as real to him as the people he was addressing. Above the crowd hung an enormous presence, as real to him as the people he was addressing. And he doesn't try and make claims of what that presence was. It was a benign presence. He did wonder whether it was the spirit of the departed Dr. Ambedkar, but he doesn't know. He didn't like to speculate too much. So over the next 4 days, Bhante travelled around, and he gave 11. So over 4 days, he gave 11 talks, condolence talks, and addressed in total to 200,000, roughly 200,000 people. So this took an enormous amount. But what he says is of this period, he says, my own spiritual experience during this time was most peculiar. I felt that I was not a personal, but an impersonal force. At one stage, I was working quite literally without any thought, just as if one is in samadhi, which is a relaxed meditation state. I also felt hardly any tiredness, certainly not at all what one would have expected from such a tremendous strain. He goes on to say, when I left Nagpur, I felt quite refreshed and rested. So after 11 lectures over 4 days, addressing 200,000 people in profound grief, he felt quite refreshed and rested. And this is used as an example of opening up to Dharma-nirma processes, so serving others, David Mitra used a lovely phrase the other week. What did he say? Responding to appropriately to whatever situation is presented. Yeah, that's responding appropriately to whatever situation is presented, without any trace of self-interest. So by impersonal, that's what we're talking about. No self-interest at all. Responding to the objective situation. This is an example par excellence. So how to get into that position? So we could look at, the background to that is Bhante's life. It didn't just happen. He didn't just hear the news and was able to respond. What we're talking about is a lifetime of faith and practice and dedication to this principle of serving and responding appropriately. And Bhante was 16 when he first found out that he was a Buddhist, so this was pre-war. There weren't probably many 16-year-old working class boys who read the Diamond Sutra, which is notoriously... Has anyone read the Diamond Sutra? No, I haven't. Notoriously befuddling Buddhist text. And he read that and had a profound realisation that he was a Buddhist. So he's an unusual guy. And as I said, he went to India. Luckily, the army took him to India. And when the war was over, he just left the army. He just deserted, and he and his friend burned their passports and just went on a striving quest around India. He was determined to get ordained as a Buddhist monk. And this was filled with disappointments. It wasn't that easy. It was very disappointing to go to the land of the Buddha's birth and find Buddhism in such disarray. And after a lot of travelling and walking, I'm sort of amazed at the determination. If I come up to a door that's closed and I'm expecting it to be open, I'm like, I'll turn away. But he went on foot around different parts of India, looking for a Buddhist context. Very idealistic. And eventually he did find context. He did find teachers. He did find someone who could ordain him as a monk, a bhikkhu. And by the time we reached this point, talking about with Dr. Ambedkar, he'd had 12 years of very systematic meditation practice, very dedicated, determined meditation practice. He'd also been practicing a life of discipline. He'd had a lifestyle of renunciation, his ethical conduct, he'd been working on that. And I do remember him, I can't exactly remember the details, he'd been asked to do a lecture, and the lecture was advertised on a false premise. And Bhante didn't know that until he turned up. And then he just refused to do that lecture because it was, the people who'd arrived had been lied to. And he refused. And he says when he got home, he himself felt the sense of wonderful confidence that comes from truthfulness, with acting with integrity. So reading his memoirs, you get little tastes of his growth as well. Yeah, huge faith and determination, and also day-to-day kindness. Yeah, so he's responding to. He's meeting all sorts of characters. Like dropouts from the West looking for certain tantric initiations, the royalty from here, the other Asian countries. He's meeting different Buddhist practitioners. He's engaging with the servants of the local area, and he gives an impression of very attentive listener, very really paying attention to the details of people's lives. So his life, what I'm trying to say is that his life wasn't very glamorous. He's travelling a lot in India as well, giving tours, spending a lot of time in the cheapest public transport. He's listening to people moaning basically a lot, and really trying to help them, as well as his personal practice, devotion, performing rituals, puja, and meditation. Also, there's a lot of politics with the various Buddhist organisations and friction between the Hindus and other monks. So he's always trying to tease that apart to preserve the integrity of Buddhism, as well as suffering ill health. I could go on, editing Buddhist magazines, lecturing, and just developing friendships. A lot of friends. So in this paper, there are various ways various ways of exploring this idea of attenuating or seeing through this fixed sense of selfhood. And one of the ways that's really encouraged, and it's very, very effective, is serving. Okay, so this idea of service, serving the Dharma, serving the truth. And that's what Bhante is doing, as well as his personal practice, his meditation practice, and his ethical practice. He's serving, and he met a teacher, Jagdish Kashyap, when he was in Kalimpong. This is where he's based. And Jagdish was around for a little while, and then he just said, stay here and work for the good of Buddhism. I mean, it's a fairly broad instruction, isn't it? But Bhante had actually decided that he'd done a lot of meditation, and he realised that he wasn't making as much progress as he wanted in terms of letting go of selfhood. And one of the ways he thought to do that is just to submit to the teacher's instructions, like totally submit to the Guru. So that's what he did. And so when Jagdish Kashyap said, stay here and work for the good of Buddhism, Bhante put all his energy into doing that. So this idea of personal practice is very, very good, but we're only going to make progress in moving away from self-interest if we serve. It's only through an encounter with other that we get the chance to open up to other. And the point is that we need to respond to living beings. This may be in a simple, if we can sort of ask ourselves, can't we, how that could be, and it may be in a very simple material way, charitable actions. Last week, Jnanavacha, he encouraged us, didn't he, to just do a generous act every day, one that you wouldn't normally do, just to see what happens. Yeah, I mean, if we can take the principle of generosity really, really to heart, we're onto a very good thing. Last summer I think I was on a retreat with Padmavajra, and he's a very long-standing practitioner in our movement. He comes here and teaches sometimes on Monday nights, so you may know him. And whenever I was at the dinner table with Padmavajra, I just noticed, well, one is he was so engaging with everyone around him at the dinner table. When we'd all finished our first course, he asked everyone, maybe 8 people, if they wanted any seconds. Okay, so he would go up with your plate and get you a serving of seconds, bring it back to the table. And there was something so striking about a senior order member doing such a simple act of humility and generousness and attentiveness. It was beautiful to watch. So the small things, even the small things, they'll enhance other people's lives and they'll enhance their own. Yeah. And if we ourselves in our own practice want to know what's next, we can just ask ourselves, where do I feel this resistance? What is our working edge? And look at those resistances. Where do we feel a bit lazy? Where do we not want to just help someone? There's plenty of detail in day-to-day life for us to put this into practice. We don't need to go to, luckily we don't need to go to India and burn our passports. We've got the teachings here now, and we can put it into practice. I say that, but I also say, but if there's something radical you feel the urge to do, then maybe think about that too. Yeah, don't want to discourage you. Yeah. Are there any questions at the moment, at this point? Or any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts about noticing when you've gone beyond yourself a little bit, putting words into your mouth? Has anyone had that experience that it's sort of it's felt that it's changed something, that has been positive? It's been a positive thing. So going beyond yourself, practicing maybe generosity. Am I right? Is that a positive thing?
I think you can just step out the door and go into the street, and already there's 1,000 opportunities to do something.
Yeah.
You don't actually have to have, I'm going to do something.
Yeah.
Is it not?
Yeah.
Little scenarios that you see that are that people come to you.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing helping a stranger, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, any other experiences or thoughts around that? I think one of the things that is important to remember is that we might not feel like that we're the best person to do something. I think we get so constricted by our view of what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. We're very inhibited. Bhante, who there's no doubt about it. He's started a very significant Buddhist movement that's got thousands of adherents in the West and in India and many other countries around the world now. He says that he doesn't really feel like he was the best person to do that. He would have probably thrived personally much more just living quite a quiet, scholarly monk life, so reading, studying Buddhist texts, studying philosophy. So he did this, what he did to set this movement up, he did it in spite of himself. I think we also know that flavour, in spite of yourself, you do something. And I guess that's what I would ask you to do starting off with over the week and for the rest of your life. Just what can you do in spite of your own restrictions? What are you able to do? I get a flavour of this for my sins. I'm a painter, and if I'm painting, I've got so much rubbish going through my mind. But if I've got an object that I can focus on, or an idea, and I just keep going in spite of the thoughts of like fake hunger, or I need more coffee, or whatever, basically resistance, or just like the radio on in the back of your mind, not saying anything of any relevance at all. Despite that, sometimes I'm able to produce something that I feel pleased with, and I feel like when that happens, it's not actually, that isn't anything to do with me. It's in spite of myself. Yeah. And we might get that in meditation as well. Do you know that flavour of sitting down and despite our state of mind, despite whatever we've come to the cushion with, something else can happen. And it doesn't feel like us, it just feels of a different ilk. There's lots of more I was going to say. I'm just going to see what to edit out. So I suppose, with following this line of thought of in spite of ourselves or our resistances, just look for opportunities as well where you can serve. One thing is that sort of charitable work, alleviating material suffering, giving aid to people, and also maybe just think about, how can I serve the Dharma? How can I do what Bhante's done? How can I serve this principle, Dharma Niyama processes? Even if we only have a little inkling that this might be worth doing, how can we align ourselves more with it? One of the great experiences of doing this, of the service, is being on a retreat team. So I don't know if any of you have ever been on retreat or even been on a team. My experience is that it's very easy to see the context in which you're giving. So you've got quite a contained context, or even just being on a team for a night like tonight. You just sort of dedicate yourself to that context, and it's very refreshing. It's a relief. It's a relief to not have to wrangle about what you're doing. I want some me time, and I haven't finished this novel, and I'm actually really tired. So, all of that is totally irrelevant. You've just got to do the next thing. Someone needs some bedding. Someone's got to lead the meditation. The food's got a bit behind. You just got to do the next thing. And the days pass, and by the end, as you may be tired, but there's a different feeling of energy that is very, very different from the sort of caffeinated, driven energy of city life. So that's I'd just ask you to look for contexts in which you can get in touch with that, to work towards something, serve something in spite of yourselves. And what I'm not talking about is doormat martyrdom, so giving, I think you know that, don't you? Get that flavour. I'm not talking about letting people manipulate you or something. That wouldn't fit into this principle of responding appropriately. Yeah, and I'll just finish with this last vignette, I suppose, from Bante's life. So soon after the conversion, the tour that he did around Dr. Ambedkar's followers, Bante met another teacher, and he'd heard that he could give him tantric initiation, so come into contact with certain archetypal figures. So he heard that he might give him that. He might or he might not. So Bante met this teacher, Chetrul Sangye Dorje, and said, and asked would he give him a teaching, asked what his tutelatory deity was, and so he's asked for a practice, a meditation practice featuring an archetypal figure, and the practice that he was given was Green Tara. Some of you may know this figure, Green Tara, and she is a bodhisattva, so a figure that represents, well, she's the bodhisattva of fearless and spontaneous helpfulness, which I find really interesting in given that just a few weeks before what feat Bante had performed, and it said that with these practices there's a natural affinity between the practitioner in the mundane sense and what the figure represents in the transcendental. She's a transcendental counterpart to his own mundane nature. Now, Chetrul Sangye Dorje didn't know what Bante had done. He just had this feeling that this was the practice for him. So, I'm going to end there. Thanks very much.